So welcome to the debut edition of the Total Rankers podcast. We are Toby and Donal. We've been listening to, and most importantly for this process, talking about music for probably nearly 40 years.
And ranking.
And always ranking, because you can't actually talk about music seriously without doing a great deal of ranking alongside.
Okay, that is true.
And I think what comes with that is that you can never talk too seriously about music.
Yep.
I think it's fair to say we have similar but overlapping musical tastes rather than completely the same. I think it's fair to say there's some music I like that you would find utterly tedious, and some music you like.
Didn't you like Goblin? Is that right?
I liked a number of groups that had a close reference to Lord of the Rings and other texts of a similar nature. And if the band names weren't that, then it was sometimes important that they played songs that referenced wizards, elves, trolls, or other beings of a magical nature. I'm pleased to say that I then grew up. But as I hope will become clear, I still harbour a great deal of affection for those general 1970s sprites.
And I've come to appreciate them more than I did then, if you see what I mean. Definitely.
Yes, and through you, I have begun to understand that Elvis wasn't just a sort of fat guy in a leather suit.
Although he was that.
At times, he certainly was that. So, the intention behind the podcast is to talk about musical rankings in a number of different areas. Some generic, some artist-specific, and present views that are hopefully interesting, maybe a bit challenging, maybe expose people to some new music, some new ideas, certainly expose each other to some new music and new ideas. The intention behind our podcast is that once it's up and running, it'll be interactive, and you should be able to find the Facebook site of Total Rankers Podcast, or if I can drag myself into the 21st century, the Twitter feed at Total Rankers Podcast, which I think is probably all one word. And then feel free to post comments, hopefully nice, which we will read out, feed into our discussion, either comments on what we've got right, what we've got wrong, what we've missed out, or again, once we're up and running and doing this seamlessly, what we would intend to do is announce at the end of each podcast what the subject matter is going to be for next week, and then invite people to comment upon that so we can feed those into the discussion in a sort of broadly live and interactive way.
Sounds great.
This being our debut podcast, we thought we would start off quite obviously with debut album. We've thought about, considered, and shared some ideas for ranking of debut albums. Donal, what do you think we're looking for in what makes a good debut album?
Well, I'm already gonna throw a spanner in the works, because I realised that actually what I was doing was coming up with my favourite debut albums. And I wouldn't necessarily defend some of them on the grounds that they're good as such, but they're definitely favourites, and I played them a lot because there's so many good debut albums. There's so many albums that launched a career. So I just got a bit swamped with numbers. Yep. But when I decided to go, okay, what actually are my favourites? What are the ones that I have listened to a lot, have I suppose had an influence on me, an effect on me? Then it became a bit easier. So I think, to answer your question about what makes a good debut album, I do like the idea that somehow in someone's career you can always go back to it and say, oh yeah, all that I'm seeing now later in their career, it's somehow lurking in that debut. Yeah. Some of the ones I've chosen didn't have long careers, but it should contain something that's elemental to the band.
So we're basically looking for artists with no artistic progression whatsoever during their career.
Yeah, and that's mainly the kind of bands I like.
That's mainly the whole canon of rock music. For me, I think when I boiled down to it, what I was looking for was artists where their debut album either created a genre or took a genre forward. I'm not sure I've completely achieved that, because obviously, like you, it's very difficult to divorce that from what you just really enjoy. But I do think there's something slightly different between a debut album of just really good stuff and a debut album where people can turn around and say, blimey, I've never heard anything like this before. And I was hoping to find the latter. And then I found, actually, funnily enough, there aren't many of those around.
after Elvis's first album. It's all basically the same. No, I also noticed that, and again, it wasn't deliberate, but I noticed that there was a sort of urgency in all the albums that I chose. They felt, I guess it's because it's new artists and they're young and they're like, look, here's us, we're fantastic, listen to everything.
Bands who felt like they were in a hurry, maybe. So why don't you start by telling us about your number 5 debut album?
Okay. The fifth one was These Were the Earlies by The Earlies. One thing I noticed is a lot of the debut albums are easily, the band name and the debut and the album name are often similar, if not the same. They slightly mixed it up with adding These Were, but it is basically The Earlies.
Yeah. My instant reaction to this is, when you sent it over, I'd never heard of The Earlies.
I can understand that. There was a time when I too had never heard of The Earlies, and I think that they didn't necessarily take off that much on a huge scale. I mean, I don't know if they're still going even. So this is kind of more the earlies work. There is possibly late earlies work, but I'm not so familiar with that. This was their debut, and it's got one sort of great feature about it, which is that they never met. So it was 4 guys, 2 of them in Manchester and 2 of them in Texas, and they did the whole thing over the internet, which just on its own is a great idea. The only song I know where that was done was Ebony and Ivory, where Stevie Wonder and Paul McCartney kind of famously didn't meet. And I think even in the video, when they're walking on the giant piano and Stevie's kind of sitting on a giant F sharp, they weren't actually there. They weren't on the same piano. They may have been on a giant piano.
Taking that as an example, given that Ebony and Ivory was the nadir of 2 careers, I wonder whether that's not a great omen for These Were the Earlies by the Earlies. So why does it hit your top 5?
I think it's my top 5. I listened to it quite a lot at a certain stage, and I think it was one of when I was getting a little bit more into, I suppose, what I might call more modern music, leaving behind a little bit of my 60s, 70s heyday. So this has got obviously influenced by more like dance music. There's, drum machines. It's much more repetitive, lots of loops. But I just really liked the layering of sound. They just really, in a way, the fact that they weren't there and doing it all over the computer becomes part of it, because they're obviously just adding bits, twiddling with bits, but it's very non-organic. I mean, it's all electronically done, and that kind of is there, but it's not unpleasantly so. But it's not a band playing; it's completely created on a computer with all that brings, for better or worse. And I liked the fact of the endless loops and the rhythms. The lyrics are kind of funny. They're a bit like sort of self-help, sort of Jack Handey lyrics, which I quite liked, just sort of slightly meaningless pleasantries. And there's a sort of dreamy, distant quality to both the singing and the overall arrangements, which I very much liked. And I think it took me in a whole direction of listening to music and making music. I wanted to make music of sort of loops and blips and blops. With meaningless Jack Handey style lyrics, if possible, though I don't think I could come up with them as well as they did. But yeah.
So I had never heard of this, and in preparation for this, I listened to it. So here's what I thought. Firstly, I thought I could see why you liked it. It starts off with what you can only describe as a Beach Boys harmony, and then it then transitions into something, as you say, with a drum machine, a very electronic feel. And yeah, I agree, that's really interesting. I found it mildly irritating at times in the way I found. Do you remember the Fleet Foxes?
Yes.
The Fleet Foxes for me were like fingernails on a blackboard.
And even worse, because you had a sense that you should be liking them.
Well, I exactly, yes. So I thought I should be liking them, and then I thought, why do I hate them? And then I saw that actually they were 23-year-olds with great big lumberjack beards. And I thought, okay, well, I can see why I hate them. That's why I hate them. But halfway through this album, there's a song called Morning Wonder, which I thought was absolutely fantastic. And there were 2 or 3 times, that song particularly stuck with me, but there were 2 or 3 other times when I thought I really did think it hit. So although it's a slightly left field choice, given the entire canon of popular music, I understand why you chose it, and I certainly can see the quality in it, and it is quite it's quite unusual.
Yeah, and it's funny in a way. I mean, I did try to listen to some later earlies, and I didn't like it as much. And I don't think after they met, never quite recaptured the magic of never having met. And it's funny. I said earlier about urgency. This album has no urgency at all, really. This is blokes, and you can sort of see them in sort of rainy Manchester on the fiddling about and talking to each other. Oh, what should we do? What should we do? And it's got that intricate fiddly quality, which I liked.
So those were the earlies by the earlies is your number 5.
Thank you.
My number 5 is, perhaps unsurprisingly, In the Court of the Crimson King.
Here we go.
By King Crimson. Initially and in no way pretentiously subtitled An Observation by King Crimson.
I didn't even notice that bit.
Yeah, says it on the spine. So King Crimson, a lunatic band that have been off and on since 1969, led by an insane guitarist called Robert Fripp, who, so I understand, is such a megalomaniac and a control freak that he cannot keep a band together for more than like 20 minutes before he upsets somebody or causes them to have mental health problems. This was their first album. They were fresh off the block. They had come to London. They recorded this album in about 6 weeks. They appeared on the bill at the Rolling Stones legendary live gig in Hyde Park, and apparently, stole the show. And what you have is something that I think doesn't sound like anything else. A high level of musicianship, quite extraordinary. The first song, 21st Century Schizoid Man, which became sort of the most famous one, is just mad. It starts off with almost a sort of heavy blues riff, and then after a while it goes into a sort of jazz rock frenzied groove.
Or rock jazz, I think.
It's also, and then it goes into a couple of wonderful tunes, and then in the middle of side 2 there's about 8 minutes of ambient noises, which, I mean, on the one level is quite tedious. I tend to move past that bit, but again, that hadn't been done before. And the thing you said in the introduction about how that there was something that was reflected in the artist's career, what Fripp did mainly during the 70s and the early 80s was flip between when he could get King Crimson together and actually get musicians in a room who would play with him, and also doing ambient albums with Brian Eno. And you can see from this album why he would end up doing those two bizarrely different things. It also has the first appearance of the lyrics of Peter Sinfield, which are, Peter Sinfield became the go-to person for really bad 1970s lyrics. But 21st Century Schizoid Man starts off with cat's foot, iron claw, neurosurgeon screams for more, at paranoia's poison door, 21st Century Schizoid Man. Now, there has rarely been such lyrical bollocks on a record, and that in itself, it has value.
It does, but it worked. Well, it's the old sort of what bopaloo bop thing, isn't it? It's like it's nonsense. Right. But I when I listened to it, I didn't think this is nonsense. I just thought this is great. I enjoyed it. It was the only song I'd actually heard from the album, probably linked to the Rolling Stones. And that bit where the band are playing the sort of riddly diddly jazz bit, it's just amazing that they're all in time. And you're like, God, what's the album Beefheart's Trout Mask replica? They're all locked in a house for 7 months in the desert. I mean, the skill, the complexity, I was dazzling. And I was slightly afraid though, because I thought, oh my God, have I got 40 minutes of this in a confined space? It could become dangerous, just the intensity of it. But as soon as that song was finished, just these beautiful ballads just sort of opened up like flowers in the rain, ballads about trees and all kinds of things. And I was blown away by those. I thought they were fantastic. Yeah,
and the last tune, called The Crimson King, is just magnificent.
Well, what a riff! What a riff! It's great. And again, blown away by it, the epicness of that sort of chorus riff that they play. Yeah.
So they never played together again. Greg Lake went on to Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Ian McDonald went on to found Foreigner, bizarrely, and play Feels Like the First Time. The drummer, guy called Mike Giles, who's absolutely superb, basically never did anything again. He did a few sort of bizarre sessions and disappeared. So In the Court of the Crimson King, and also, I just say, the most incredible album cover. It's well known for it. It is wonderful. And the guy who designed it, who painted it, died later in 1970. So it was the only album cover he ever produced. And it is stunning. So that's my number 5.
It was great. I was surprised how much I enjoyed it. Really good. Really good. Never listened to it before and I thought it was great. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you, and thank you, Robert Fripp.
There you go. Very few people have ever said a thank you, Robert Fripp.
And he wouldn't care if you said thank you.
No, he'd probably be offended.
He obviously hadn't been rude enough to me. He would think, like, what have I done wrong here?
Exactly. Okay, what's your number 4?
Number 4. I'll go with this one. I'll go with this. You know me, Toby. You know me a long time. You know my favourite band. My favourite band are the Beatles. I'm not alone in that. I know there's nothing. I'm not ashamed. I'm not going to hide it. I love the Beatles, and of course their first album is called Please Please Me. And I love this album. I bought it a long time ago. I remember going to a shop in Muswell Hill with 2p's and 5p's in a bag, and the poor bloke counting the $4.99. I just thought he must have thought I thought running a record shop was going to make me cool, but at that moment he must have been thinking, no, it isn't. But and I love it. What do I love about it? It's let's go from the outside in. I mean, the cover is the sort of famous cover of the 4 of them looking over a balcony, and to me it feels like actually the end of something. To me it's the end of that kind of corporate modernity of like the 50s. Ever since after that, modern tended to mean sort of countercultural, and so but they're sort of very firmly rooted in that sort of area. It's got sleeve notes, long sleeve notes, an essay by someone called Tony Barrow, who is their publicist. And it's great. It's like having your dad give you a lecture about the album before you're allowed to listen to it. And it's just astonishing what he says. I mean, he'll give you some examples of the sentences. My natural hometown interest in the group prevented me taking a totally unbiased view of their early successes. I mean, what a thing to say on a rock album.
But and do you think that was a way of just trying to highbrow it a bit, trying to make some kind of connection between, 4 rather scruffy youths from Liverpool and that slightly highbrow, sniffy, British late 50s, early 60s, thing that just about accepted Cliff Richard and Tommy Steele.
Making it respectable. I think it's just a dad mentality. I just think this is very good, and I'd like to talk at you about it for some time, kids, before you listen to it. There's another great sentence he says earlier. This quartet are visually and musically the most exciting and accomplished group to emerge since the Shadows, which is incredible. You could be right, but I think it's just dull, being dull and having a chance to just show off. But it livens up, the music livens up, and it was famously recorded in one long session, 12 or 13 hours. And the myth is how it was to recreate the excitement of a night in the cavern. You can't help but think it was probably because they were trying to do it for as little money as possible. But let's go with the myth, because that's rock and roll, isn't it? So the myth is it was trying to recreate the energy of a concert. And I don't know if it succeeds at that, but it's certainly got the energy. It's a mixture of their original songs and covers. The originals are all great. Everything from I Saw Her Standing There to Please Please Me. There's a Place, which is one of my favourite Lennon McCartney. It's that rare thing of an introspective song that isn't tedious.
But how extraordinary to write an introspective song on your first album at that time, in 1962. I think it's extraordinary. There's a Place.
It is. It's a great song. They then have lots of covers, which I kind of they're not. Some of them are good. Some of them are less good. I mean, Twist and Shout, of course, is fantastic. I like Anna, Go to Him. Chains is a bit dull, but it's George singing, and George always, it's a chance to put the kettle on when the Beatles album is playing, usually, isn't it? So
no, come on.
He's great. His one on side 2 is a Lennon McCartney. Do you want to know a secret? When you really care. It's so scout. It's fantastic. Yeah. It's got a few little quirks. Like all the songs are listed as written by McCartney Lennon, so it's the wrong way around. And at some point, John had a word in Brian's ear, and I guess, and they flipped that around. But it's a great record. It's a great record. Lots of energy, great fun.
I think it's wonderful. I think it actually is better than their LPs for a while afterwards. They did, very often in those early Beatles LPs, there is clearly a little bit of filler.
Yeah.
And even though I think wasn't A Taste of Honey, isn't it sometimes that and Mr. Moonlight are reckoned as the worst Beatles songs ever when polls come up. I think sometimes A Taste of Honey doesn't even beat You Know My Name, Look Up the Number.
It's double tracked Paul, is it? It's Paul singing with Paul.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, no, it's terrible.
But even with all of that, it is superb. Listening to Love Me Do Again was really interesting because it's so simple. It is like it's the kind of song you can imagine the Quarrymen having been playing on the back of a truck at the church fete. There's hardly any words and there's hardly any instrumentation, but it's just brilliant.
I've always struggled a bit with Love Me Do. I never really liked it, and I was reading just the other day about the Vapors with I'm Turning Japanese, which was their second single, and then I was reading, they knew it was going to be great, but they released another song first just to get their name out there, and I wondered, was that the Love Me Do story? Like, let's get some song that's not quite as good out there first. I don't think that is the truth, but
maybe they thought it was safer.
Who knows? But it's a great record. It's a great record.
Okay, my number 4 is Vivid by Living Colour. Living Colour were and actually are essentially I suppose one would call them a hard rock band, a rock funk band, who emerged in the late 80s, and they produced this album called Vivid. They went on tour with the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones even though I don't like them, they seem to feature in all my choices. I came to be aware of them because I read an article in the Bible that was Melody Maker, talking about how there had been a dispute on the tour because they'd been opening. Next on the bill was Guns N' Roses, and then there was the Stones. And a dispute had emerged because they had objected to being a black band. They'd objected to a Guns N' Roses song that used the N-word. And Axl Rose had released some statement going into vast detail about how he was justified in using the N-word because he was only talking about a certain kind of black person, not all black people. And Vernon Reid, who's the guitarist of Living Colour, who is not only a phenomenal musician, but incredibly articulate and politically engaged man, had issued this sort of stunning riposte. And there was this kind of general swell in the groovy music press about how not only had they trounced over Axl Rose's politics, but also they were stealing the show at every one of these gigs on the Stones tour. I didn't go and see the Stones because I didn't,
for like
reasons we can discuss at another time. But I thought, all right, I'm gonna pick up the album, and I started listening. And track 1, side 1 of their first album is a song called Cult of Personality. Everything about that song is like, I'm not sure you could write a heavy rock song better than this. And I remember listening to it the first time in my room at college and being absolutely blown away.
Wow.
And then it doesn't stop. And the quality of every single song on this album is just incredible. I mean, you talk about an album with no filler. From the first line of Cult of Personality to the last bit of Which Way to America, the last song, which is basically a sort of primal scream from Corey Glover, the singer, who's very good at primal screams, absolutely blew me away. It's rock. It's got a funky undertone. The drummer, Will Calhoun, became my favorite drummer from that moment, and that's never really changed.
Wow.
It has a cover of an intensely boring Talking Heads song that becomes an amazing piece of rock and roll. And to give you an idea, the guest artists on it are firstly Chuck D and Flavor Flav, and secondly Mick Jagger playing a harmonica solo. I mean, just extraordinary.
Which normally would be a terrible prospect.
It would be it would be enough to make me put the record back on the shelf. But not with Vivid. Living Colour never really made it. They made a second album, Time's Up, which is almost as good, which is still superb. They made a third album that slipped off a bit, and then they disappeared. They've made 3 more albums since that time, which have been a bit varying in quality. They tour every now and then. They're still great when they tour. But here's what really struck me when I was thinking about this and preparing for this. at the time, this concept of sort of this marriage between hard rock and funk was a thing with a capital T. And for me as a drummer, I thought, yes, this is exactly where I want to be, because by that point I was listening to quite a lot of funk. So there was Living Colour, there was the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and there was Fishbone. And these three bands were very seen as the forefront of this metal funk, this funk metal thing that was going to happen and be big. Now, what's interesting is only one of those three bands made it to stardom, and they were the only one of the bands that were white.
Yep.
And I thought about that, and I thought, because when I was listening to Vivid recently, I thought, yeah, this is not an album that's going to play in Middle America.
It's it's an endlessly important and interesting question, isn't it? I read about them trying to get a record contract, and they were very clear that they didn't get a record contract for ages because they were black, and the record companies didn't like the mix of the music and the demographic. No, and it was yet
who
again,
are you going to sell it to? Who is going to buy this record except actually just people who really appreciate amazing music?
Yeah, and apparently Mick Jagger did his little bit to try and help them out, which again, interestingly, slightly irritated them. They said, "Isn't it a shame we had to get help from a powerful white guy to get in?" It's a tricky one, I find. That Beatles album, I Please Me, I did a little bit of homework for this, and all the cover versions are cover versions of Black American artists, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. So that was their kind of music. How sort of diversity and integration work in rock music is complicated, isn't it? Is it in the music? Is it in the artists? But you got to think, at least for a long period, there must have been a lot of racism at the business end.
Yeah. Oh, well, but so much. I mean, we're diverging a little bit from Living Colour, but so much of that early, certainly in the late 50s, that early period of rock and roll was that songs by people like Chuck Berry and Little Richard would be covered by Pat Boone, who would go on to make a lot more money and sell a lot more records.
But I really enjoyed the album. I remembered them. I remembered, I think I was living in America briefly, and they were sort of on MTV, sort of on repeat. I seem to remember some very loud trousers. Have I made that up? Or
no, you haven't. They had a fabulous. And I'm ashamed to say it was one I tried to follow.
I know why you had those terrible trousers. I get it now.
What I must have looked like, but it was part of the look. I mean, I thought it was just a fantastic look and fantastic attitude. What's your choice number 3, Donal?
My choice number 3 is continuing with the sort of blokes playing guitars theme. This is the Housemartins, Hull 4, London 0. The cover very much appeals to me. The singer is in a cardigan having a good time, which is not something one often sees. He's sort of dancing around. One of the things about this music, and maybe it's one of the things about debut albums as well, it really was an invitation to a world about which I knew nothing, which as a teenager I obviously knew nothing. But the particular invite was, on the sleeve inside there's lots of very political statements, and there's take Jesus, take Marx, take hope. So this is sort of blokes from Hull in cardigans who are Christian Marxists. Yeah. That's not something I'd ever encountered before.
No, I didn't realise that at the time either.
Yeah, so it was an invite to a world, I think, and which is, when you're a teenager especially, that's very appealing. And what a world. I mean, the music is very simple. It's very direct. It's probably, the whole album is probably the same 4 chords, sometimes even in the same order. But that doesn't seem to matter. The lyrics have that sense they could have been written in a geography lesson on a sort of scruffy exercise book. But sometimes they don't quite scan properly, and they rushing the lyrics. But it all just adds to that sense of urgency we kind of mentioned before. I think the things that lift it a little bit up for me, one is that I just like the look and the, like I said, the invitation to some strange little culture. But I love that kind of singing. P.D. Heaton has got that kind of crystal clear singing that, Carl Wilson, Karen Carpenter, these sort of beautiful, clear voices, which I really love. He's trying to sound a bit soulful at times, and there's a bit of he sort of growls every now and then, which actually I don't think he needs to do. He's just a great singer, and the band are, it's simple, but they're good. They really hold it together. The rhythm section really works. Norman Cook, the bassist, went on to become Fatboy Slim. So he had great success. P.D. Heaton went into Beautiful South. I don't know what happened to the guitarist, Dan Cullymore. The drummer unfortunately attacked someone with an axe and was committed to a mental hospital, but that happens in rock and roll sometimes. And they never really recaptured this, I have to say. I bought their second album in great excitement, and something had gone, something had been lost. So, but this first album, I just love it. I love the energy. I love the shouty sort of content of the lyrics, but beautifully sung. And I like the Cardigans and the funny plasticine dancing video. The whole thing's just great.
My recollection of it, I mean, is obviously the single, Happy Hour. It was a huge, huge hit. And the dance. And I just remember everywhere suddenly people doing this weird sort of chicken dance. And
it's a dance for people who can't dance. You can now dance. That's
great. There was something really nice about four people who didn't look like they would even, play instruments, let alone be in a band.
Yes.
Singing rather nerdy songs, doing an utterly nerdy dance. And somehow everybody had got on board, because I think there was something very fresh, very genuine, very, very honest, very about it. It wasn't heavy and earnest. It was just, this is what we're going to do. I agree. I think it's fun, and I will listen to it again. I can't say that I'm desperate to go and listen to it again, I have to confess. But
you only need to listen to one song, and you basically heard the whole album.
There's an element of that, I think, yes, going on. So my number 3 choice is Are You Experienced by the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Because it is
inexperience.
It is so phenomenal. It kind of takes the breath away. So, a little bit of introduction. In 1967, it's Hendrix's first album. When you look at the track listing, my feeling is always, how is it possible that somebody produced this much incredible music in one sitting?
It's sort of like a greatest hits album, isn't it? Practically, it's amazing.
Exactly, it is exactly. It's how is that possible? It's so extraordinary, also, that so far as I understand, the original UK release did not include Purple Haze, Hey Joe, or The Wind Cries Mary.
Which I read a story about The Wind Cries Mary, which I think links within what you're saying, how good the album is, that they had 20-minute studio time at the end. And Jimmy said, okay, I've got a new song. Here we go. He played it to them on the guitar, and then they just recorded it in one take. That's it. That's the quality of these musicians. They'd only met a few weeks before. It's not like they've been playing together for years.
Yeah.
Just great musicians, something really gelled for them. Yes, and they just turn out this incredible series of songs, played perfectly.
And it also introduces, if you like, certainly for me, this. So the concept of the rock trio, I mean, is a very, very difficult one, because Cream were already around, and I cannot stand Cream.
Is that Eric Clapton? Is that Ginger Baker? Is it just Cream generally? I mean,
I've got to confess, it's mainly Eric, who I have just an irrational hatred for.
It's not irrational. It's not irrational.
But it's more than that. It is something about just, I think the music doesn't work. And I think, so there are plenty of other trios. I mean, obviously, all of, frankly, very questionable quality. Vanilla Fudge came next, and oh my God. Then in the 70s later, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, who are certainly an acquired taste, and then Rush, who are a highly acquired taste. And the rock trio is it's a bit of a curate's egg. It's a difficult thing to get right, because you haven't got much going on. But the Jimi Hendrix Experience, because this is very much a band album. It's not just a Jimi Hendrix album. It's a band album. I mean, again, it's a little bit like one says with Vivid. There is absolutely nothing on here that isn't extraordinary. I mean, if you look at the American track listing, it kicks off with Purple Haze. That's a good start. The intro to Purple Haze is just phenomenal. And it finishes with Are You Experienced, which is basically, the Beatles' Tomorrow Never Knows, played by somebody who actually understands rock music. And there's nothing in between that lets the side down. If one were able to travel back to 1969 and hear this for the first time, I think he would think, oh my God, what is going on here?
One thing I saw a nice program a few years ago about him, and it was pointing out that he'd sort of toured around on the, I think it's called the Chitlin circuit in the south, just playing backing for tours. So he just knew how to play absolutely everything. And a lot of the songs, I think, like Third Stone from the Sun, for example, if you listen to it very carefully, as the TV show was helping you do, he switches between jazz and then there's a sort of rock and roll lick, and then he does some, and it's just like, it's just constant. He's moving around so fast, but it never feels like he's showing off or doing something. Well, of course he's showing off, he's a rock star, but it doesn't feel like he's being clever. It just is seamless. And I suppose it's something about how the rhythm section just absolutely holds it together, and he's allowed to do his amazing wizardry. But it's fantastic. It's such deep music, but it doesn't feel ponderous at all. It just feels electric and spontaneous.
No.
And it's an amazing.
For me, Hey Joe's almost the weakest track on this album. I mean, because I just think, Third Stone from the Sun is astonishing.
It's a bit of a love me do, isn't it? It's the first single, but it's
exactly. Third Stone from the Sun, covered by Santana, and also the inspiration for I'm Too Sexy by Right Said Fred.
I did not know that.
Yeah, because in the chorus you get the riff. You obviously haven't listened to I'm Too Sexy enough.
Or at least not after Jimi Hendrix Experience. Are You Experienced?
Try and segue them in. He maybe didn't quite reproduce this. I mean, I think Axis Bold Is Love is also a brilliant album, but it doesn't quite have that sense that the next track comes along and you're like, oh my God, this one's even better.
Yeah.
How is that possible? Okay, your number two.
Number two, continuing the year 1967, although I think started recording it in 1966, are one of my favourite bands. Again, I suspect someone you probably find really annoying most of the time. This is The Doors. I love this album, and I listened to, I hadn't listened to it for a while, but I put it on to listen to it, and I realised I still love this album. Songs I didn't like the Alabama song I like more. It's sort of cliched in a way. I mean, it just came out in early 1967, but it's like the counterpoint to the Summer of Love, except actually at that point it was really the Winter of Love. It's only January, but still, in sort of myth, it gives a counterpoint to the sort of psychedelia, flowers and peppermint and all that sort of stuff. And I think it does.
Well, I mean, it really, really does. Listening to this album even now is almost a kind of frightening experience.
It is. It's dark. It's genuinely dark. They look a bit spooky on the cover, and it is dark. Things that as you being a drummer, I mean, I think the drummer is just incredible on this record. I think he's constantly going into this kind of Latin bossa nova style. It's on the core, the verse of Light My Fire. It's the opener of the album, of course, is that great beat, and I think he's a fantastic drummer, and really. He's so versatile and sensitive, such a great counterpoint to the singer, who's just this sort of brooding monster. And the whole thing just hangs together beautifully. The carnival style keyboards from Ray Manzarek, and it's great. And another thing I like about it as an album is it feels like a first. You talked about albums that change things. With the ludicrous the end. That's the end of the album. I played it to my daughter when she was quite little, and obviously the first line is "This is the end," and she's like, "Why is he saying that at the beginning?" Which I thought was, again, good observation. I don't think anyone had tried, an 11-minute closer.
Actually,
lots of people tried to. Oh, go on.
Bob had the year before. I mean, the end is like for people who found Desolation Row too upbeat.
It's disturbing, and really he edits himself a little bit, but not much. And Jim Morrison, of course, has just spawned an army of people in leather trousers and shirts spouting poetry, and that's a crime. But he was the first, so he's allowed to do it. And I think he is the first proper rock star, just foully behaved, obnoxious person who takes himself totally seriously but looks great in leather trousers. So yeah, I think it's a great record. I love The Doors. I love this record. It's good.
I think the end is extraordinary, and I think a number of things. Firstly, I think how incredibly brave to do that, to decide to do that. Okay, yes, we'll have an 11-minute song. I mean, as I say, it had been done before, but not like this. And I think if you're going to write a song called The End and put it on the end of your album and make it 11 minutes long, you've got to live up to what the expectation of that in the audience.
Right.
And I think it does, because it's essentially Armageddon. All I can think about is, choppers coming over the trees.
Yeah.
This album for me is just so connected to Apocalypse Now. And even though, as you say, I'm not a huge Doors fan, I cannot in any way deny that the album is extraordinary.
And it's got lots of little quirks like that. The Alabama song is a 1920s Weimar Republic song, and it's got that sort of decadent feel. It doesn't feel out of place.
Right.
A sort of minor thing about it, I noticed. I listened to sort of their live albums. They were playing a lot of these songs still, sort of later in their career, which I think bands often don't go back to the debut album so often, but they were still going. It's a great record, great songs that define them completely, but not in a constricting way, I don't think, and that's why they were still going back to the songs.
The only thing I would say is that on one level, Light My Fire is, I'm afraid, completely overpowered by the Shirley Bassey version.
Yeah, I totally agree.
And when we get round to doing our ranking of cover versions that defeated the original,
oh, I can't wait.
Shirley's Light My Fire is going to be high on my list.
You've stolen it. That's unfair.
It is phenomenal. Okay, my number 2 is Music from Big Pink by The Band. I'm a little bit worried that we're staying very much in a similar time period. We leap forward a whole 12 months to 1968.
Hey, listen, my first choice was From This Millennium. Come on.
It was. You put me to shame. Music from Big Pink by The Band. So the band were Canadians. They were originally called Levon and the Hawks after their drummer, Levon Helm. They famously came, and various members of them backed Bob Dylan on the Electric Tour. They then hooked up with Dylan and they did what then became the Basement Tapes. But then the band went on and they made their own record. And they made this thing called Music from Big Pink. Now, this is an album that I only listen to about once a year. And I do it because I don't want to dull the beauty by too much familiarity. I want to be surprised by it every time I listen to it. And I am. It is an album that created a genre, what they now call Americana, which didn't exist. From the very first chords of the very first song, you're listening to something that is so different and so unique and so unusual. Again, it just has this enormous capacity to surprise. Some of the songs, like We Can Talk and Long Black Veil, they're sort of, you feel like you're listening to songs that might have been, even though A We Can Talk is an original, you feel like you're listening to songs that might have been sung 50, 60 years previously.
Yes, so you can imagine people in plaid shirts and beards, but not like the Fleet Foxes, actually.
Exactly.
They've got beards because they don't have razors. Singing them, it's got that feature of you sometimes find on great records. When I listen to it, I was like, oh, they sound like everybody else. And then I kind of was like, well, yeah, they sound like everybody else because everybody's copied.
Everybody sounds like them. Exactly.
Yeah. And it's one of those records when you try and listen to music before it, like, oh yeah, nothing sounds like that. It really invented music.
A couple of things that are really extraordinary. The song on the second side called Chest Fever. It starts with a sort of organ solo that wouldn't be out of place on an early Deep Purple album if John Lord was playing it, or on a sort of Emerson, Lake and Palmer album. And then it goes into this incredible riff that actually is funky. And it goes through about 4 different feels in its 5 minutes. And Chest Fever is like, it's like a rock opera in 5 minutes. It's absolutely stunning. But then the killer is, and the bit that makes me cry, is you get all the way to the end, and at the end is I Shall Be Released. Now, if you've heard the Dylan version of I Shall Be Released, it's quite light and jaunty. Right. And then you hear Richard Manuel sing it in his high falsetto, and it is the most beautiful. I genuinely think it's the most beautiful thing. It's the most beautiful singing I think I have ever heard. Because
he's kind of straining for his register, isn't it? He's at the top of his register and really going for it.
And he
beautiful.
Brings the poetry out of the words. I mean, in a way that, Dylan quite often, let's be honest, wasn't the best purveyor of his own poetry because of his nasal whine. But you listen to Richard Manuel sing it. And then, of course, if you know a bit about the band, you'll know that Richard Manuel had an incredibly sad life. He had alcohol problems for years. He had substance abuse problems. He died quite early. He just couldn't get it together. The rest of the band spent a long time trying to help him, support him, put him back together. it was pretty soon after this that basically he couldn't sing this song again because he so screwed his voice
Oh,
by
dear.
by booze and drugs. And it's so beautiful. It's just incredible. I love it. And as I say, I don't listen to it very often just so I don't become blasé about its beauty.
That's a lovely idea. That's a lovely idea.
But we're going to get even better because that's not even the number one. So, Donal, what is your number one debut album of all time?
There's no point hanging about. Let's just get straight to it. It's simple. It's not just my favourite. It is the best. This is the best debut album of all time. The whole history of popular music is Licence to Ill by the Beastie Boys. I don't hear anyone arguing. Silence out there. I'm not surprised. It's got everything. So we start from the front, the cover. Yeah, it's got a pun title. It took me a while to get the pun. I didn't get it for a few years. It's got a kind of visual joke of the plane crashing. Then you open it up and it's the Beastie Boys exactly as I wanted them to look in whatever it was, 1987, when I was sort of spotty teenager. I just loved the Beastie Boys. It was, mentioned it with the House Martins, kind of entry to a world. Well, this was the ultimate for me. It's like, this is American guys having a great time, being really funny. I was absolutely swept up in it. I was shocked to find out many years later that the whole thing was a kind of shtick. It was an act. They were all very sophisticated characters, particularly at the late Adam Yauch, and they sort of made up these characters for the Beastie Boys. But I got completely swept away with it. I thought, yeah, that's just what they're really like, and I want to be like that too. And so I stole a Volkswagen sign off a car and did everything. I did everything. That's just the band. Never mind the music inside. It's practically an afterthought. But when you do go in, I mean, it's a great record. I think a very influential record. It's it's just at that moment where rock and hip hop were sort of meeting with Walk This Way, with Run DMC, who they toured with, and I think they had on the same label. So this is just another of that sort of style. So there's a lot of Led Zepp drumming. John Bonham makes an appearance, I think, on the first track. And I love that mix of the rock guitar and the hip hop beat. It just gave rock that sort of push that somehow it had lost a little bit in some of the more noodly rock music. It's got so much heft to it. The lyrics are, I had no idea what they're talking about most of the time, which only added to it. There's one song about they're going on about Davy Jones' lock. I don't know what they're talking about, but that was all the part of it. I only understood little bits, and it was like little glimpses, like a strobe, like just little glimpses of another world that sounded so exciting and fantastic. Listening to it again, there are some songs are better than others, definitely. Some of them are a bit silly. But I still think it stands up as just a original album. It again, I suppose, a little bit of that sense of it's hard for things to quite sound the same afterwards. Now, when I hear a rock track, I really want that beat. When I hear hip hop, I want some distorted guitar on it, and it just defined a sort of look and a sensibility, if you like. And I just love it.
My lasting impression of Licence to Ill was that. During the mid and late 80s, I worked every summer on a kids camp. The summer after this came out, every single kid on that camp went around doing one of two things: either singing girls, dum 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 dum, dum, or just walking up to me and go, "Chilling on a corner on a hot summer's day, me and my posse and MCA." All of those kids, they had committed this entire album to heart. And it wasn't just, because you see, one of the other interesting things about this album, which is also true of my number one, which we'll come to, is my kids really like it. And there's no reason why they should, because it is very much a thing of its time. But they like it because actually the songs are great and they're fun. And I don't think anybody can not love Fight for Your Right to Party.
Yeah. It's big. It's got it's teenage music, and in that sense, it's got a timelessness to it. There's some element of it surely always appeals to the young and spotty. It's great, and I drank it up.
Now, the same couldn't be said for my number one choice.
Well, it depends what your idea of fun is.
The thing about this, so my number one choice is an album that you got before me, and I don't mean purchased. I mean you got it. You understood it before I did. It was an album that featured in both of our teenage years. And as I say, at the time, when I was 14, 15, I didn't get it. I got it when I was about 17 or 18, when I understood what the singer meant when he complained later that it sounded like the Rolling Stones, which was why he then promptly left the band for that and other reasons. But what I thought was, okay, I'm now listening to this. For me, I felt I had to be a little bit more musically mature to understand how musically good this album is. So my number one is Nevermind the Bollocks by the Sex Pistols. Johnny Rotten was right. It does sound a bit like the Rolling Stones, but the Rolling Stones should have been so lucky to ever write 10 or 11 rock songs that are this consistently good. Yeah. And that was what I didn't get. I got the snarling, sneering bit is great. It's fantastic, but it's not the whole story. The lyrics are extraordinary. I mean, I think Bodies is one of the most lyrically horrendous songs.
That is the one. I think Bodies is the epitome, if you like, of the album. It may not be the heart of it, but there's nothing quite. It never goes further than that. It's amazing.
Absolutely. And I read an article, someone saying, well, the trouble with the album is Bodies because it's misogynist and anti-abortion and racist. And I thought, firstly, fuck, have I had it wrong for all these years? Because I have to say, I think it's completely the opposite.
Yeah, no, I think that's nonsense.
I mean, it is nonsense, isn't it? It is the most incredible social commentary.
It's got. I like about it. It's shocking. There's something. Shocking. It's still shocking about the lyrics. It's very confrontational, but there's also a kind of vulnerability to lurking behind it. He sounds such a lost. Or he is singing about such lost, tragic people, and he's so angry and confrontational about it. But the vulnerability never quite goes away. It's an incredible lyrics, incredible singing, incredible song.
And it also has, I mean, which, let's be honest, music should have, is that level of accessibility. I mean, there was that level for us, for you and me, particularly when we were kids, when we were teenagers playing in a band, that you listened to this and you thought, I can do that.
Yep.
And there's nothing wrong with that because, that was what people thought about Rock Around the Clock and Hound Dog. And when one thinks about just the genius of that intro riff and Pretty Vacant, that it is just an open A chord.
It's funny. I think I mentioned one of the albums that fell off the list for me was The Clash by The Clash, which actually had that intro is on one of the songs on that album. I can't remember which one. It's exactly the same riff. Yeah. That album, I think, was probably much truer to the sort of punk ethos in the Myth. It's very lo-fi. I think it was so lo-fi they didn't release it in the States. This album actually is not true to that kind of DIY. No. It's such brilliantly produced music, but it feels like you can go out and play it yourself.
And Steve Jones was a good guitarist. Yeah, I mean he's a proper rock guitarist.
I was reading about the making of it, and it's lots of layers of guitars. I mean, he was in there overdubbing on he had access to lots of different guitars, and he was trying it. It's layers upon layers of guitars. It only sounds simple. He played all the bass parts, I think, as well. Using guitar chords. They kicked the bassist out because he kept talking about the Beatles, apparently, which is a great reason to kick out your main songwriter. Just a sort of pointless factoid. Talking about how well made the album is. The producer actually produced part of the White Album. He played harpsichord on Piggies. He mixed Dark Side of the Moon.
Yeah.
They brought in this like DIY mentality, but boy, they met the right guy who was like, right, I'll show you how to make it sound like DIY.
I would like to think that they, not necessarily the band, but the people around them, apart from the revolting Malcolm McLaren, they knew they had quality on their hands. Yeah. And there is also something fantastically romantic about the fact that it never happened again.
It is. It's a beautiful thing. It's a thing of beauty. Great cover. Great everything. I really noticed a sort of minor thing, but Oasis. Just that. It's just the same album. It's almost like they took some backing tracks that were discarded, and the idea at some point Oasis, I remember, seemed to recall, felt dangerous, rightly or wrongly. But I wonder if it was just a folk memory, if you like, of this album. It's that music, it's that guitar sound, but the Sex Pistols really did seem dangerous. Maybe they are. The confrontation, the sense of violence, the anger at hypocrisy, it's all in there. It's just an amazing record.
Yeah, it is. It is fantastic, and I'm glad I got there in the end. Okay, so those are our top 10 debut records.
It's funny, isn't it? Like I said, at the beginning, I ended up with my favourites. In a way, there aren't that many, I think, bands where I really like their debut so much. There's lots of bands where I like later on when they got going, but these ones are just great.
Yeah, and I think, interestingly, just looking at the list, it's almost a sort of breakdown of half and half between bands who went on to have, who sprouted wings and flew,
yeah,
and bands who didn't, who one might say this was as good as it got. I think one of the interesting things is, where do they go from here? And some of them really couldn't ever get over what they'd done.
It's funny thinking about. I mentioned the Beatles cover as they feel like the end of something. Their next cover is the Beatles cover with the faces in black and white and shade. Completely 60s modernity. Like they've changed. They've changed the second album in a successful way, gone forward. The music, whatever. But yes, it must be. You have to change, don't you, after your debut? While at the same time, there's got to be something integral to you that never quite goes away, and that's a really difficult shift, I imagine, to do.
Absolutely, because the temptation is going to be, well, this worked once, let's do it again.
Yeah.
Or at least if that isn't the temptation of you as an artist, that is going to be quite likely to be the pressure that you get from the commercial
man,
the money men.
The man. It's the man. It's not me. It's the man.
Okay, well, I think let's leave it there. So next time, what is our topic for next time?
Well, we've obviously had a very successful debut, I think, but you never know what's going to happen the next one. Is it going to work, or is it going to be a flop? And that's what the next theme is flops, but not just any flops. We're looking for is albums that flopped, but looking back on it, are great albums. Quality flops is probably the summary of it. So not
Rubies
bad
in
flop.
the dust. We're looking for the Heaven's Gate of popular music.
Yes.
Love that.
Turned
Very
out
good.
to be really good.
Fabulous. Well, thanks very much. Thank you for listening. Again, do find us on Facebook, Total Rankers Podcast, and hopefully also on Twitters at Total Rankers Podcast. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.
You too. Good to talk.